You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 18th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. Coming up on today's programme.
We'll be talking about land. It's a lot of land. It's a lot different than it was before the wars, you know.
Is the United States preparing to cede Crimea to Russia on Ukraine's behalf? Also ahead, Israel resumes bombing Gaza. We'll have the latest. Later in the show, Pope Francis publishes a brief meditation on conflict and language, and we'll be in Estonia to find out what the rest of us should be learning about cybersecurity.
And actually, thanks to Russia, we have gotten really good at cybersecurity from the very beginning.
That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Mueller. At least 400 people are reported dead and perhaps twice that many injured in Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, the most significant such action since a ceasefire was agreed in January. It is not yet clear exactly what the target was, though 4 high-ranking Hamas officials have been named among the dead. Israel claimed that Hamas had been preparing to attack Israel. Hamas denies this. Israel has also issued evacuation orders for specific Gaza neighbourhoods, prompting speculation of a renewed invasion. Well, I'm joined now by Hannah McCarthy, foreign correspondent based in Beirut, and Nada AlTaher, senior foreign reporter at The National, currently based in Dubai. Nada, first of all, you have been in touch with people in Gaza. What is the latest you are hearing?
We're hearing reports that are very reminiscent of the first several months of the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. Morgues are full to the brim. There's there's no space to bury the dead. Hospitals, which there's not a single fully functioning hospital in Gaza, given how decimated the medical infrastructure has been. These hospitals are not well equipped. They're not able to handle the very high influx of casualties between dead and injured and maimed. With the recent blockade as well of aid and anything that is to sustain any sort of life in Gaza, including fuel, medical equipment, trauma kits, medicine, antibiotics, any sort of pain-killing drugs, anything. It's extremely impossible to treat that many people. And we have been told as well from the doctors there that people have been dying simply due to a lack of care, because the operating theaters, those that are operating, are not able to handle all the cases that are coming in. They're full. And people are simply dying because they are not able to be even transported to a place where they can get medical assistance because of a lack of fuel. So it's grim on every single level, and this kind of resumption in bombardment has impacts that have incredible ripple effects. Not just physical damage and death and destruction, but intangible things that we don't immediately see.
And Hannah, to bring you in, some Israeli media reports have it that these strikes were decided upon about a week ago. Do we know what the actual justification for this is and what the real reason might be?
Sure. So Netanyahu's office has released a statement saying the objective of this return to strikes on Gaza included the release of all hostages, both the living and the dead. We know that that 59 hostages remain in Gaza, but only about less than half of them are believed to still be alive. However, we've seen instant criticism from a variety of groups within Israel, including the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, who said that the Israeli government government has chosen to abandon the hostages by returning to these strikes. We also had an extremely punchy opinion piece in Haaretz by Amos Harel, who said that Netanyahu's true objective appears increasingly clear: a gradual slide towards an authoritarian-style regime whose survival he will try to secure through perpetual war on multiple fronts. It's also noteworthy that today Netanyahu was supposed to give testimony at his criminal trial regarding bribery allegations.
And to bring you back in, Nada, I mean, is it possible that Israel is also attempting to, I guess, achieve some sort of demonstrable military victory over Hamas? Because it was clear from the hostage releases that we have seen, thanks to those slightly bizarre and grotesque theatrical productions that Hamas staged around them, that Hamas still does have a considerable armed presence in Gaza.
Considerable armed presence or not, what we are seeing is an outrageously high number of civilian casualties in comparison to the number of Hamas officials that have been pronounced or announced to be dead. We have been seeing images of children once again being maimed, infants being killed, mothers who have nothing to do with any of this. And I think that anybody can agree that these innocents are not party or punishable for the actions of a for a militant group. So I'm not quite sure what military gains there are to make through the killing of women and children.
And to follow that up, Hannah, looking especially at these evacuation orders that Israel is also reported to have issued, does it look like Israel is preparing to launch another ground incursion into Gaza?
It certainly looks like the Israeli government is ramping up its plans for return on the ground troops and an increased number of strikes. It's not yet a foregone conclusion. There had been some positive signs that the ceasefire might progress to the second phase. We had direct talks between the US and Hamas for the first time in years. We also had Hamas offering to release an Israeli-American hostage and the bodies of 4 others. But again, this is all put up for question now that the White House has confirmed that the Trump administration was consulted before these strikes on Gaza were launched. So again, there was a sign that perhaps Trump could force the Israeli government's hand in terms of progressing to the second phase, but that is much less clear now.
Nada, are we beginning to see much in the way of reaction from Middle Eastern governments? There was, of course, this conference in Cairo reasonably recently discussing the future of Gaza and trying to come up with some plan other than US President Donald Trump's telegraphed ideas about turning it into some sort of Mediterranean resort. Is there going to be, I guess, an increased level of impatience escalating to outrage with Israel over this resumption of hostilities?
We've already seen Egypt, the international NGOs, Turkey, even Russia, condemnations really pouring out, and the very strongly worded ones as well. I do believe that given how close things were to going into a phase 2, into touching this idea that Gaza can be stable once again, it can be rebuilt, that there would be hope for the millions that live there that have lost every single thing that they care about, and then taking all of that hope and light away from them so quickly and so brutally and dramatically. Yes, there have been a lot of condemnations pouring in from states and from international NGOs that have been warning, because the situation now is more dire than ever. Given the blockades, given the decimation, given the electricity that has been cut off from the desalination plant that is now operating only at 13%. The situation is more horrific than anyone could describe, to be honest.
Nada AlTaher, senior foreign correspondent at The National, and Hannah McCarthy, foreign correspondent based in Beirut. Thank you both for joining us. Here is Carlotta Rebello with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. NATO members Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia plan to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention banning anti-personnel mines due to the military threat from their neighbour Russia. Quitting the 1997 treaty will allow Poland and the 3 Baltic nations to start stockpiling landmines again. South Korean police have started providing additional security for the leader of the main opposition Democratic Party, Lee Jae-myung, after lawmakers warned of a potential assassination plot targeting him. The warning comes as Seoul's police force prepares for potential clashes between impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol's supporters and his opponents, as the court is expected to make a decision on his trial this week. And anti-tourism protesters have vowed to take to the streets of Ibiza again after preventing visitors from gaining access to a popular selfie spot on the island. Residents and landowners in the Calador de San Josep area have now blocked off the unofficial car park with rocks and cordoned off the footpaths to stop the excessive amount of traffic, wild parties and waste left behind by tourists. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Carlotta. You are listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Mueller. In the next few hours, US President Donald Trump is due to speak to Russian President Vladimir Putin about Ukraine. This follows a joint US-Ukraine offer of a 30-day ceasefire to which Russia has so far furnished a variety of answers which have in common that they are not yes. Plausible reporting has it that Trump is prepared to include among the assets he speaks of dividing Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula seized and annexed by Russia in 2014, which is to say that the US might formally recognise Russia's sovereignty over Crimea in return for concessions as yet unspecified. Well, I'm joined with more on this and other Ukrainian headlines by Julia Lassica, researcher and writer at Monocle. How much nervousness is there, Julia, among your fellow Ukrainians about today's call?
I think it feels really surreal. I think that, it's a stunning turnaround. Even in the summer under Biden, Ukrainians were sometimes signing their emails with saying "See you next summer in Crimea," and we were sort of celebrating the strikes that were taking place on the bridge that Putin had built to, unite the Russian mainland with Crimea, because of course there is no land bridge there is no territorial connection between mainland Russia and Crimea. So it's a stunning turnaround, and I think that Ukrainians have been advised, do not kind of fall into any hysteria, any panic. Of course, that's very difficult to do. Sort of try to continue living your life until something has been decided. But I think it is a very tricky situation in which it's very surreal. We have 2 leaders of the world talking above your head, and that their decisions that they will be making may potentially impact people. We'll see how Europe reacts. Of course, you've got Keir Starmer's coalition of the willing, that's been said to be moving into the operational phase. Maybe this will help sort of strengthen, bolster Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine itself has so many assets that it can use in its fight against Russia. But it is a very surreal feeling. It's history repeating itself. It's the Second World War potentially all over again.
But how much sentiment is there still in Ukraine along the lines of, I guess what would have been and still is the ideal and indeed the just and proper outcome from Ukraine's point of view, that basically Russia packs up and goes home and Ukraine is restored to the borders which Russia, among other countries, agreed to recognise? Is there still much will in Ukraine to fight on for that, whatever the cost?
I think we have to be practical with the tools that we're given. So we'll see what happens at the end of this call. We'll see whether Putin is dragging this out or not, because, one of the things that officials have been briefing is that potentially he's dragging out these talks. Trump will potentially get upset with him and want faster results, put Russia under harsher sanctions, etc. But so we'll see what the practical tools that we are given to work with and what Europe as well offers. I think that what Ukrainians are trying to urge the world to remember, and the first thing that came into my mind was the Yalta Conference in 1945, when Europe was carved up into spheres of influence between the US and the Soviet Union. And we saw that plunged so many people, my family members included. We were plunged behind an iron curtain, and that just festered conflict and festered war and repression and people being thrown into prison with no charges levelled against them, and just this fear of this terror, this rule of terror. So that didn't end the war. The Second World War did not end in Poland and in Ukraine and other countries that had suffered under Nazi Germany. It continued after the Yalta Conference. So again, it's, Crimea is the centre of all of this, because Yalta is a city in Crimea. This is where we decide whether we're going to move into, a pre-war time, I guess, or we will start to move towards justice and international kind of stability.
What kind of options does Ukraine and its European allies still have, though, if Russia and the United States come to some agreement which is not palatable to Ukraine and the rest of Europe? Because the one thing that I do think is interesting and perhaps an undersold detail is that more than once, Kremlin sources, including Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, who I don't think is encouraged to freelance on the foreign policy angle, has said that Russia is not at all bothered if Ukraine or whatever is left of it joins the European Union. It does seem to be NATO that they are morbidly obsessed with. Does that strike you as something that might be palatable to a plurality of Ukrainian opinion, that most of Ukraine is sort of fast-tracked into the EU and Russia more or less keeps what it holds, and we all hope, perhaps as Germans did circa the 1950s, 1960s, that we'll get it all back eventually?
I think that if that happens, if Ukraine is carved up in that way, then all Europe can possibly do is rearm, because all that Russia will be doing then, and we've seen this, people, Macron in his statement to the French people a few weeks ago said, Russia is not a country that looks like it's slowing down. It's only speeding up, and speeding up in terms of rearmament and in terms of creating a larger, stronger, better army that will be better, at attacking other people, other nations. And so all Europe can possibly do in that situation is rearm, speed up what they're doing already. We've had encouraging signs from the European Union, and tomorrow there's that vote that will be taking place in the German parliament about whether or not they will take on this historic debt break and, rearm as well. So all that Europe can possibly do there is just shore up its defences and help, use Ukraine's assets, which I mentioned before. Ukraine is unparalleled, and I've said this so many times, Ukraine is unparalleled with its drone production, with how quickly it is making arms. The Danish Prime Minister was talking about this. She was really worried. She said that at the Munich Security Conference, it's worrying that a country at war, Ukraine, can produce arms so much faster than peacetime Europe. Ukrainians are working under bombs, under missiles, and yet they're creating arms so much faster than us. There's so much expertise that can be used there. So I think in that situation, it's not about, now we can sort of settle into this quasi-peace state. No, rearm, and that's the only option that Europe has.
Just finally and quickly, does it also strike you as significant, the reporting that President Putin might insist on a pause in assistance to Ukraine as part of his conditions for ceasing fire?
Yes, so we have seen that report. It was an exclusive on Bloomberg a few hours ago. And I think that if that happens again, I mean, we saw it. It happened for a few days, a few weeks ago. And of course, we had that disastrous pause in arms when Congress was sort of wrangling over terms a year or so ago in the spring of last year. And that was disastrous for Ukraine. So I think that if that happens, yes, I mean, Europe has to step up. Otherwise, we'll see some very serious scenes of fighting on the ground in Ukraine.
Julia Lassica, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It must be pretty weird being Pope at any time, but especially so towards the end of one's tenure. The spectacle of major news networks competing to book apartments overlooking St. Peter's Square cannot be good for the morale. Nevertheless, Pope Francis is persisting valiantly through a bout of ill health, which has now seen him hospitalised for a month. The 88-year-old pontiff has sent a letter to the editor of Corriere della Sera explaining that his recent difficulties have sharpened his thinking on a few subjects, notably human conflict and the absurdity thereof. Well, I'm joined with more on this from Monocle's Zurich studios by Juliet Linley, journalist and former Vatican correspondent. Juliet, what were your impressions of Pope Francis's brief, actually, missive to the editor of Corriere della Sera?
Hi, Andrew. So, first of all, it was front page of Corriere della Sera, which just goes to show how, especially in Italy, the Pope still makes headlines always, constantly. And you have a photo of the Pope, not the most recent photo, but it does say, Il Papa, disarmiamo la terra. We need to disarm the world. And this is an open letter, first of all, from the Pope, thanking the editor of Corriere, Luciano Fontana, for his get well missive, because Fontana had written to him saying, I want to give you my support during your hospitalization. But then the letter continues with the Pope telling the editor to relaunch and amplify this papal appeal for peace and disarmament. So the Pope writes that his lengthy illness has made him more lucid to the absurdity of war, and he renews his call for diplomacy and international organizations to find a new vitality and credibility. Now, of course, the question is Vatican diplomacy, possibly, hopefully. We're not seeing a lot of that in the headlines, certainly, Andrew. Now, of course, this is something that the Pope should be saying, isn't it? I mean, he should be thinking that. So it's not really earth-shattering, but he does then go on to talk about how the media can maybe play a role. Now, of course, were it someone else saying these sort of disarm the world, it would make more headlines. Imagine Putin or Netanyahu saying, the time has come for worldwide disarmament. But so the Pope is calling on the media to sort of be careful with what words they use, because they should feel the full importance of words. And he says, quote, words can connect or divide, serve the truth, or use it for other ends. So he calls on journalists to disarm their words in order to disarm minds and to disarm the earth. Great words, Andrew. He does feel the media can play a big role. We can debate that.
I did think that was the more interesting part of the letter. As you correctly point out, calls for peace and disarmament are the sort of things you would expect somebody in his position to say. But is this an entirely new line from him, or has he sort of had concerns in the past about the temperature and the nature of public discourse?
No, he's often spoken out, of course, on worldwide affairs. He's often called for peaceful solutions, whether you're looking at Gaza and Israel, whether you're looking at Russia and Ukraine. He's careful of not stepping on too many toes, especially on not stepping on too many Russian toes. That was certainly the case over the last years. With Gaza, he's much more forthcoming in his disapproval of what Israel is doing. And let's not forget that throughout this month-long stay in hospital, we constantly get news from the Vatican press office that he checks in on a daily basis with the parish priest in Gaza. So he's an Argentinian himself, and he is certainly trying to give this impression that he is very much on it, despite having been sort of the impression was that certainly in the first couple of weeks that his life was very much hanging in the balance. And Francis is very media friendly. He's given more interviews to the press than any other pope ever. And he's written more books. I mean, he's written dozens and dozens of books, including his own autobiography at the end of last year, just ahead of the Jubilee year. So he always makes an effort to interact with journalists, because I think he is aware of the role that the media can play. Now, today, how much of a role they can, we can discuss.
Juliet Linley at our Zurich studios, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Estonia is one of the most digitally advanced countries in the world. People can vote, file their taxes, start a company, and even get divorced online. On the other hand, having a fully digital society makes Estonia more susceptible, perhaps, to cyber attacks and runs the risk of alienating those citizens not computer literate. We dispatched our Helsinki correspondent Petri Burtsoff to Tallinn to meet Petra Holm, a digital transformation advisor at the E-Estonia Briefing Centre. Petri began by asking what led Estonia to becoming such a global pioneer in digitalisation.
Once we broke loose from the Soviet occupation and all of the Soviet troops left, we were presented with a unique opportunity to turn the country around. We wanted our people to enjoy the benefits of democracy and to prosper. We were presented with a lot of challenges, a non-functioning economy, because this is what the Soviet Union does to you. But we really wanted to get ahead, and Estonians were never afraid of modernization. We were actually quite open to any possibility to make life better. We took digitalization. It was a pragmatic decision, actually. It was the most efficient way to deliver services to the people who are located remotely all over Estonia. But it became a point of pride for us, something that we can export all over the world and something that we're known for.
From a citizen's perspective, digitalization makes many things easier. There's less paperwork and less time spent queuing in various government offices. But what about the fundamental human need for social interactions?
Yes, we want to free up time for everyone involved. You no longer have to take an afternoon off to visit a government office, to stand in line. I mean, of course, you can socialize while you're waiting in line for 2 hours, but is that really how we want to spend our afternoon? You don't have to be on hold for several hours while you're trying to pay your electricity bill. This is just not the reality in Estonia. So, yes, people can just conduct their business, whatever they want to do with the government, within minutes and just spend time with their family. So yes, we are saving a lot of money and we are saving a lot of time for everyone involved. Hassle-free, paper-free, very efficient service provision. But it's not just reserved for the public sector, actually. Our digital infrastructure is used by the entire society, so the citizens, the private sector. And the private sector services, actually, their efficiency affects a person's life, a citizen's life, on a daily basis, way more than efficient public services.
Not everyone, however, has access to a computer, let alone can use a smartphone to use digital services. I asked Holm how Estonia can make sure that people, such as senior citizens, are not left behind.
Well, actually, using our digital infrastructure is strictly optional. We run a dual system. Anyone who is unwilling or incapable of using digital services can do so in person, the old traditional way. And because the rest of the society, or the most of the society, are actually using the self-service of digital services, we are left with more time and more funds on our hand to address these people's needs, to service them in person. But you would be surprised how, once presented with an opportunity, people who would otherwise not consider themselves digitally savvy, how they benefit or use digital services. For example, we have e-prescriptions. 100% of the prescriptions issued in Estonia are digital, which means that everyone is withdrawing digital prescriptions. It is simply tied to the chip that we have at the back of our ID card. Everyone has one. You go to the pharmacy, you present it, you get your e-prescription. If we take, for example, iVoting, the highest percentage of people voting over the internet are people aged 75 plus.
Digitalizing the public services obviously comes with certain risks for Estonia, not the least because the country's soured relations with Russia, who regularly tries to disrupt Estonia's digital society with cyber attacks.
We cannot change our geography. And actually, thanks to Russia, we have gotten really good at cybersecurity from the very beginning. We never had any illusions about Russia. Even though they left in 1991, we designed with that in mind. The way we store data, the X-Road that allows completely decentralized databases to talk to one another, they allow the data to be very fractured. It's not stored in one database. You would have to break into dozens and possibly hundreds of databases to collect the citizens' data and to hack into E-Estonia. It's actually very costly, it's very time-consuming, it's easier to hack some other country.
And it's not just Estonians that stand to benefit from the country's digitalization. Anyone in the world can become an e-citizen of Estonia. Petra Holm explains.
Basically, it's a digital identity that is issued by the Estonian government, and almost anyone globally can apply to become an e-resident of Estonia. About a third of the people who become e-residents start a company fully remotely using our digital infrastructure. There is zero corporate tax in Estonia. A lot of them actually become e-residents so that they can co-found startups, or they actually hire local people. It allows us to diversify our economy, attract business and investment. On the other hand, e-residency is a way for us to showcase to the world how easy and efficient a digital society can be.
For Monocle in Tallinn, I'm Petri Burtsov.
Thank you, Petri. And that is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Francesca Jukes, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing returns tomorrow at the same time, midday UK. I'm Andrew Mueller. Thanks for listening.